Subtracting rational numbers. Let's first revisit the types of numbers within our number system. So we have rational numbers and irrational numbers. Rational numbers are those numbers that can be written as a quotient of two integers. For example, 11.23, 3/4, 7.12 recurring, and -9 on 2. Irrational numbers are those numbers that cannot be written as a quotient of two integers. So within the rational numbers, we have integers, which are whole numbers and their opposites. So we have -24 and 24, -36 and 36, 1 and -1, 5 and -5. Within integers, we have whole numbers, which are numbers that do not contain a fraction or a decimal. And within whole numbers, we have natural numbers, which are also referred to as our counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. There is some debate in the mathematical world about whether or not 0 is considered a natural number, but I will let you and your mathematical experiences determine that yourselves. Some examples of irrational numbers are pi, 2.7182818286, and the square root of 2. Our definition to keep in mind is difference, which is the result of subtraction. Subtracting rational numbers, our key concept to keep in mind is that when you subtract an integer, you can add its opposite instead. Subtracting rational numbers using a number line. So going back to our use of our stick figure walking along our number line, we're going to find 3 subtract -2. So we always start on 0 facing the positive direction, and our first number that we need to get to is 3. So we're going to walk forwards 3. 1, 2, 3. Then, because we are subtracting, our stick figure is going to turn around and face the opposite direction. So he's on 3 facing the opposite direction now because we're subtracting, and we're subtracting -2, and because that's a negative number, he's going to walk backwards 2 spaces. 1, 2, which brings us to 5. So 3 subtract -2 equals 5. Find 4 subtract 1. Again, starting on 0, facing the positive direction, we're going to find 4 first, which is a positive number. So we're walking forwards 1, 2, 3, 4. And then because we are subtracting, we're going to turn around and face the opposite direction, and we're subtracting a positive number 1. So we're going to walk forwards because it's a positive number 1, which brings us to 3. So 4 subtract 1 equals 3. Subtracting rational numbers by adding the opposite. So 3 subtract 2. Let's have a look at that on our number line model. We start at 0, we're going to +3 first. 1, 2, 3. And because we are subtracting, he's going to turn around and face the opposite direction, and we're subtracting a positive number 2. So he's going to walk forwards 2 spaces now. 1, 2, which brings us to 1. 3 subtract 2 is 1. Now, remember our key concept said that if we are subtracting an integer, we can instead add its opposite. So we're going to, instead of subtract, we're going to add, and we're going to add the opposite of 2, which is -2. So now we have 3 plus -2. So we start on a number line, walking forwards to 3, 1, 2, 3. Because we're adding, we're staying facing in the same direction. And what we're adding is -2. It's a negative number, so we're going to walk backwards 2 spaces. 1, 2, which brings us to 1. So we can see that 3 subtract 2 is the same as adding the opposite, or 3 plus -2. Subtracting rational numbers by adding the opposite. Let's get some more practice. So it asks us to find -10 subtract -4. Now, if we're adding the opposite instead, our equation changes from -10 subtract -4 to -10 plus 4. So instead of subtracting, we're going to add, and we're going to add the opposite of -4, which is 4. So -10 plus 4. Now we know that when we're adding numbers that have different signs, positive and negative, we have some steps to follow. So first of all, we're going to find the absolute values. So the absolute value of -10 and the absolute value of 4. and then we're going to subtract the absolute values. So the absolute value of negative 10 is 10. The absolute value of 4 is 4. So we're going to subtract these two numbers, and we end up with 6. But there's one last step. Remember, we need to have our sum then has the sign of the number with the greatest absolute value. And in this case, 10, or negative 10, had the greatest absolute value. And because it started off as a negative, our sum also gets a negative. So negative 10 subtract negative 4 gives us negative 6. Find negative 2 subtract 7. Well, we have a negative number and we're subtracting 7, but instead of subtracting, we're going to add its opposite. So we know that negative 2 subtract 7 is the same as negative 2 plus negative 7. Now, from our previous lesson, we know that a negative plus a negative equals a positive. Negative plus negative equals a negative. So, negative 2 plus negative 7 equals negative 9. Let's have a look at an application example. The research submarine Alvin was 1,500 feet below sea level, which can be indicated by negative 1,500. It then moved to 1,872 feet below sea level, or negative 1,872. How many feet did Alvin travel? So we're starting off at 1,500 feet, we're moving to 1,872 feet below sea level. So what we want to do is, instead of subtracting negative 1,500, we're going to add the opposite. And the opposite of negative 1,500 is positive 1,500. So now we have negative 1,872 plus 1,500. So first of all, we find the absolute values. The absolute value of negative 1,872 is positive 1,872. And the absolute value of 1,500 is 1,500. And then we're going to subtract the absolute values. So we have 1,872 subtract 1,500, which leaves us with 372. And remember, our sum has the sign of the greater absolute value. And in this case, the greater absolute value was 1,872, and that was a negative number. So our sum has a negative number as well. So Alvin traveled a further 372 feet below sea level, which is represented by negative 372.